If you want to be a coach in 5 years' time, you'd better up your game because artificial intelligence can already do it better than the most basic coaches can.
In what ways does a mature coach differ from a novice one?
We were appalled to find that 70% of the coaches that we observed couldn't actually coach. And they could go through a coaching model, they couldn't hold a learning conversation. A beginner coach or an immature coach, and they'll ask lots of questions. The most mature coaches are constantly questioning everything that they do, their assumptions. The success of the coaching is not your success, it's the client's success.
So what is coaching maturity and what inspired you to delve into this concept?
The most mature coaches, or the most powerful coaches that we saw, simply were there to help the client. We call them systemic eclectics because they saw the client in their systems and they started being a coach. And they started to integrate who they were with what they did and the conversations they had. We are there in service of the client. We're not there in service of the model.
What are the typical challenges an individual faces as they start to grow their maturity, their being in the conversations?
We need to take a more of a complex adaptive systemic approach. So if you're a model-based coach, a beginner coach, it's just client problem solution. The big challenge is developing your awareness of the context and the systems that create the circumstances that the client brings to the conversation. As you become more and more mature, you have empathy not just for the client, but for the system that they're a part of. What needs to change in the way that you observe things? You achieve competence by sticking to the rules. You achieve mastery by breaking them.
Hey, David, thank you so much. Such a pleasure having you again.
It's a pleasure to be here.
David, in today's conversation, I'm going to dwell deeper into a particular topic on coaching maturity because not many people talk about that. And you introduced this term coaching maturity way back, almost like 2 decades back. Fantastic. Yeah. So what is coaching maturity and what inspired you to delve into this concept of coach maturity and how has it evolved over the years?
Well, starting in about 2004, we started doing quite a lot of coach assessment centers for big corporations like Bank of America, for NUS and National Health Service in the UK. And what we observed, and we weren't looking for a mastery, we were simply looking for competence. And we were appalled to find that 70% of the coaches that we observed couldn't actually coach. They weren't able to hold a learning conversation. They could go through a coaching model, but they couldn't hold a learning conversation. And from the hundreds of coaches that we observed over several years, we established that there were 4 different mindsets, if you like, or ways of thinking about their identity as a coach and the relationship with their client. So that the concept came from, and we were able to map out those different ways of thinking looked like. And since then, in the last 5 years, we've been working with the Coach Maturity Research Group, which has been following through and doing a different research from a different perspective, and coming up with very similar answers. Not 100%, but very similar.
And you have already introduced 2 distinctions for me. One is the distinction between having competence and mastery. That's one. Second thing, you know the coaching model, and yet you're not been able to hold the coaching conversations. Now, based on the research that you've already done in the domain of coaching maturity, can you share some key insights from your research on coaching maturity and its impact on the coaching practice?
Well, from the original research, we found beginner coaches, they were caught in a trap of needing to do coaching to somebody. They made the client fit their model, whatever that was. The trouble with that is that means that you're focusing on the process, you're not focusing on the client. And then we found a lot of people outgrew that and they started doing coaching with the client, but we're still doing it. So they gave the client more say in the way the conversation went, but they were constantly going back to a model or a process because they felt comfortable doing that. Then they let go of the need to do, and they started being a coach. And they started to integrate who they were with what they did and the conversations they had. And then finally, the most mature coaches, or the most powerful coaches that we saw, simply were there to help the client. We call them systemic eclectics because they saw the client in their systems, and at the same time, they helped the client by holding them while they had the conversation they needed to have with themselves. Major difference. In the more recent research that we've been doing, questioned some of our original assumptions. So we thought that you had to go through a stage model. If you had to go through the first stage to get to the next stage, the next stage, the next stage. So we find that isn't always true. The people that come from different disciplines and so forth, who actually can come in at the being stage. For example, we've learned is that the more mature that coaches become, the more capable they become, the less they rely on process, the more they rely on themselves, and the more they use themselves. So the stricter you don't tell stories, you don't give information, absolutely wrong in terms of mature coaches. Mature coaches draw on their expertise to give context where it's appropriate. Now, there's a big difference between giving context, which is helping somebody with the quality of thinking, and advice, which is doing the thinking for them.
You use the word, they start to use themselves. And you've also used this term mastery in the initial phase of our conversation. Can you tell me more about that? What do you mean by a mature coach can use themselves and work at the context level rather than trying to fit the client into the coaching model that they have learned?
Well, one of the definitions that I like of mastery, I'm not sure who originated it, but it's a beautiful definition. You achieve competence by sticking to the rules. You achieve mastery by breaking them.
Wow.
I've been going around the world in the last few years, just talking with lots of coaches, and the message that I get for so many coaches, particularly ICF coaches, who say we've been forced to go through all this process, the ACC and the PCC, and we can do this, we can do it like this, but then we forget all that. We throw all that away. We get on with being a coach. We will use multiple different ways. Realize that we are there in service of the client. We're not there in service of the model.
Yeah, we are here in the service of the client and not here in the service of the model. David, you spoke about that it's not always you move from one to second stage to third stage to fourth stage, right? You spoke about there are four stages. One, if you could help us define what these four stages are and what challenges do people typically encounter along the way?
Well, in the first stage, when you're doing coaching to people, you're not really sure what to do. So you're using the model that you have as a crutch.
Okay.
So everything has got to fit into that model. So
Yeah.
if your toolkit is a hammer and nails, basically that's what you're going to be using.
Yeah.
Whereas if you can actually enlarge your toolkit to have a spanner and a screwdriver and some screws and various other things, now you're actually enlarging it. You can relax a little bit and say, well, okay, I can not need to be so much in control. And this need to be in control is characteristic early stage coaches. It's uncomfortable not knowing where the conversation's going. The more mature you get, the more relaxed you are. In fact, if you know where the conversation's going, it's not coaching.
Wow.
Because you're in charge. You know where the conversation is going, you must be in charge. So then when you get to being a coach, you can really relax and you can start seeing that engaging with the client in so many different ways. And this is when we start to see people using themselves. So ontological coaching and things help here too. You use your gestalt, the things that you feel as the client, you're talking with the client. They're indications, they're things they're triggers and clues for you about what's going on in the space between you. And then when you get to that systemic eclectic coach, into a space where we find that these coaches ask about a fifth of the number of questions.
Wow.
They're all powerful questions. So one of the things that we did in the assessment center, when we gathered the powerful questions that coaches asked, the ones that had real impact. And fascinatingly, we found that other than using a few rote questions, if you did have the answer, what would it be? We gathered almost no original powerful questions from coaches at the first two levels. All of the powerful questions, hundreds that we identified, came from the top two levels.
Just for my understanding, the first level that you spoke about is where the coach is dependent on the model, where it's like the beautiful analogy that you shared, the hammer and the nail, and everything for me is I'm going to hammer it, right? So that's what you call as I would try to fit the other person in the model that I've learned, which is like model-based coaching, where there's a streak to control and doing coaching where the coach at this level typically focus on a single model and apply it consistently in the coaching conversation. The second one, that's where the coach learns to let go, and thus it becomes what we call as process-based coaching. And in this level, which is level 2, David, the coach offers more flexibility and is structured around a limited set of tools where the coach has added a couple of more tools in the toolbox that they are relying on. The third one you spoke about is philosophy or discipline-based coaching. It's a little advanced where coaches at this level base their interventions on a broad philosophy rather than a singular toolkit, where you're willing to experiment and explore and stretch and see, let's see what happens. And thus it operates in a relationship-based manner. And the fourth one that you mentioned is, you said systemic eclectic, right?
Yes.
And that's where the coaches operate at this level, focus on empowering the client. It's all about the other person, where you are serving the client rather than serving the model, where you are in service for the other person. David, in your understanding, what are the typical challenges an individual faces as they start to grow their maturity, their being in the conversations?
One of the things that we notice is that linearity, the idea that you can follow a nice linear process. When that doesn't work, what do you replace it with? You have to be able to replace it with a systemic perspective. Systems are working in multiple layers of complexity. So if you're a model-based coach, a beginner coach, it's just client problem solution. As you become more and more mature, you eventually end up as a systemic eclectic coach. You see the client in their system, and the interaction between the client and everything that's going on around them. You have empathy not just for the client, but for the system that they're a part of. There's a mile between these, but you have to develop it. So the big challenge is developing your awareness of the context and the systems that create the circumstances that the client brings to the conversation.
Once you understand the context one is operating from, the empathy automatically grows.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So David, in your experience, co-authored and authored over 75 books, and I'm sure you would have written a couple of more. Have you?
We're getting up, but by the end of this year, we should have 80 published. Yes.
I'm not surprised. Yeah. So, in what ways does a mature coach differ from a novice one, especially in terms of, you use the word identity. My word is mindset, approach, the way they look at a coaching engagement, not just a coaching conversation. So if you can just share your views on this.
Well, I think one of the things that we see is the level of humility increases dramatically. You realize that you're a work in progress, and that the success of the coaching is not your success, it's the client's success. You're there simply to stimulate the right conversations. And so as a beginner coach, you tend to want to measure your success by how successful your client is. That's not really the measure, because we begin to see success in many different ways. So if success is the client suddenly decides, actually, I want to do something completely different in my life. Now, in terms of the sponsor that hired you, hang on, you were supposed to help this person overcome a particular issue, and now they've gone. Success is defined differently, but we're there in service of the client in a co-learning environment. The most mature coaches are constantly questioning everything that they do, their assumptions. They bring this deep empathy, as I said, into the system, not just to the individual. They use a lot of supervision, a lot of reflection. All of the coaches that we interviewed, the mature coaches we interviewed in the latest research, spent a lot of time in reflection in multiple different forms. But they saw reflection that led to greater self-awareness being a critical part of them being able to use themselves in service to their clients. If you don't understand yourself and who you are, it's much more difficult to use yourself.
I heard it somewhere, who you are is how you coach, David, and that in all ways, shape and form, change the trajectory of my life. Forget about just being a coach. I think who you are is how you live. Who you are is how you lead. You lead a program on coaching maturity. What are some practical strategies for coaches to enhance the quality of their reflective practices that could help them build their self-awareness?
One of the fundamental principles is that if you're going to move from one way of thinking to another, first you've got to be able to register your dissatisfaction. with the approaches that you have. And so it's raising your awareness of what isn't working as well as it could. That's a starting point. But we have a little technique that we find is really, really helpful. You spend some time in reflection, thinking about how you feel. You spend some time thinking about how you think, feeling about how you think, and feeling about how you feel. And just
Wow.
analyzing yourself, your emotions during and after a
Wow.
coaching session.
It's such a powerful technique, David. What you said is that experience where you're experiencing dissatisfaction. And then you said reflecting about how you're feeling and how you're thinking, then thinking about your feeling, and then feeling about your thinking.
Yes.
It's quite holistic and wholesome in nature.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm just reflecting on right now what I'm thinking and how am I thinking about my feeling. Now, where do we bring in compassion? Because there's a tendency, the moment I start to think about my feeling, there's a possibility that I'll get into judgment mode.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where the layers of emotions come in the play.
Yes.
How would we integrate and embrace compassion and stay away from judging ourselves? That could be self-sabotaging.
So it's helpful to distinguish between empathy, sympathy, and compassion. You know, and you can be sympathetic, glad that's not me. It's that sort of type of you can have empathy where you begin to connect at a much deeper level with somebody and to feel for them. And that empathy brings with it feeling that you ought to be able to do something for them. But compassion, you feel that you must do something for them. The passion, it comes from the word comes from the Christian religions, the passion of Christ. So compassion is suffering with. You feel compelled to help them to relieve their suffering. It's having that deeper sense of connection with the other person. And that's what we see with the systemic eclectic coaches. A beginner coach or an immature coach, I'll ask lots of questions. There'll be lots of energy going in. But the systemic eclectic will be far, far calmer. And so with the client most of the time, the energy lies in the space between them. If you put a light bulb there, and the light bulb will start flashing, simply because of the quality of the energy between the two people. And the energy comes from connectedness.
Wow. The energy comes from the connectedness. That itself is $1 million quote.
You plug in a lamp, work until you connect it to the power source.
Yeah. David, in the initial phase of this conversation, you use this term how the systemic eclectic coach is able to use themselves in service of the other person. Now, since we are talking about coaching maturity, how do mature coaches leverage their own experiences and wisdom to support and serve their clients?
We can define 3 kinds of wisdom. There's skinny wisdom, which is being an expert in a particular topic. There's broad wisdom, which is the wisdom that comes from life experience. And there's meta wisdom, which comes from the ability to pull together ideas, concepts, emotions, almost anything from a multitude of different sources. So it's the integration of multiple wisdoms. What we're doing as the systemic eclectic coaches, we're really working in those last 2. We're bringing our life experience, our experience in business, our experience as a human being into the conversation to help us empathize better, or have greater compassion, to help us understand the other person in their own terms, not in our terms. So how are they making sense of their world, not how am I making sense of your world? So we basically, then it comes down to, do we use story? And what we're discovering in many cultures around the world is that parable and story are integral to mature coaching.
Wow.
So people respond well to story. Stories excite your imagination, your creativity. selection of the story. It's not about how clever the coach is, but choosing a story that actually makes them think. The parables that you get, those are the things that enable you to make associations that lead to creative breakthroughs by clients.
When you are talking about systemic, my assumption is this is what is related and connected with the meta wisdom that you spoke about, because in meta wisdom, you have been able to pull different threads together in service of others, right?
Yes.
And the linear coaching approach the world has been taking for so many years, right? I remember when I went through my initial phase of my coaching journey, almost like 2 decades back, David, the first lesson that I learned was that coaching is all about listening and asking questions. Then I realized that's only one of the very basic skills. If you can help me understand the importance of viewing coaching from a systemic perspective and how it differs from a problem-focused approach that most of us tend to use in our coaching conversation, where we look at it 2 + 2 = 4, where we look at cause and the effect.
We all like to have a certain amount of certainty.
Yeah.
And in the more complex the world becomes, the more that clients and particularly leaders in organizations want certainty. I want to be able to park that, not have to think about that, because I know what's going to happen. And it's also, and that means towards solutions that work in the moment, but may not actually work in the long term. We get pushed towards more and more quick fixes.
Yeah.
And that we see basic level coaching doing it. It rarely results in transformation. It results in quick fixes.
Yeah.
And we need to get beyond that and look at different levels of complexity. So if we look at the individual and we see the immediate system around them, their boss, their direct reports, their family, and so forth, then we can see a lot of how all of those forces are combining to help them achieve what they want to achieve or not. You can help them to work with each of those elements of the system. But if we go beyond that, look at the interaction between those elements, the other stakeholders in that system, it's starting to get a lot more complex. And so now we're starting to see that actually we need to take more of a complex adaptive systemic approach rather than a simple systems approach. And so deeply we get into a client's issues and the issues of the organization around them, the more complex it becomes. And that is a critical skill for coaches, but equally we're seeing it's a critical skill for leaders to be able to think in more complex ways, more systemic. Now, if you as a coach aren't at least as systemically aware and competent as your clients need to be, the wrong job.
Yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about, because these were some initial challenges that I found when I started coaching. I had no clue about the world they were coming from, neither as a practitioner nor as somebody who has served the organization for 10, 15 years. And I would find it extremely difficult to connect with the challenges that they were sharing with me. Forget about understanding and forget about coaching and forget about coaching at the context level or at the process level. I would get sucked into that, shucks, man, I don't understand that. And that's where I'll start to beat myself. And slowly and steadily, as you said it, it's very important to understand the context of the other person. Let's try and understand that, David. Let's accept it that today, when somebody is hiring you as a coach for their team members, they would expect some quick fixes and some results from you, right? They would say, I want my executive to get more productive, have better interpersonal skills, so that at the end of the day, they should be able to perform better and add to numbers. Now, what advice would you give to coaches looking to break free from the goal obsession and embrace a more holistic view of coaching?
Yes. So the first thing that we've noted from the experience of hundreds of coaches is that when we get faced with a simplistic, almost always those things are very easy to implement. As soon as you put them into a bigger context. So what the coaches do is to contract with their client that they're going to deal with those things, and then we'll get on with the stuff that's really important to you. Because almost invariably, when these goals are set by somebody else, by a sponsor, they're not the things that are really on front of mind for the client. So this is a chore you've got to do, like filling in your expenses form, for example. So you relegate these simplistic outcomes to where they belong. be dealt with a lot more easily. And you can reinforce that whole process by going to the sponsor and sitting with the sponsor and the client and saying, okay, so you as a sponsor, you want these outcomes. So what are you going to do to make sure that those outcomes are more likely to happen? So you can't just abdicate this to me as a coach client to sort out. There's a system going on there, there's context. So how are you going to change the context? How are you going to notice the changes that happen? For example, a big question, because bosses tend to only note the things that reinforce their previous view rather than and they discount any aberrations that they see. So it's this understanding of the setting, contracting at the beginning, that we're going to focus on things that are really important.
Precisely. Currently I'm involved in a coaching project with an organization, an IT organization, technology organization, doing some really path-breaking work. Now, the interesting part is one of the common patterns that I'm realizing is that people are very aggressive in their approach, very, very aggressive in their approach. There is a need to control, and that's a common pattern that I'm realizing. And then I had a conversation with the chairman of this organization, and I realized that where this aggression, where this controlling pattern coming from. And there I was stuck because there's something in the context that people have picked up. And that is their strategies to stay relevant in the context that they're working with. Now, if somebody is telling me that I would want this person to be more kind and have more empathy towards their team members, what they don't realize is they have learned this way of being just to fit in the culture that they are working in. And that's something that we need to be very, very mindful of. But the question is, as a coach, how can I challenge or push back the sponsor? Now, in your experience, David, how can coaches create a personalized learning plan to accelerate their evolution, their growth, their maturity as a coach?
Well, one of the things we could do is to actually challenge it, make sure that we're challenging ourselves. So what assumptions are you going to question that you have? What clients are you going to work with who are going to stretch you? We're doing some fascinating work at the moment relating to neurodiversity or neurodivergence. Benefit that comes from really getting deeply to understand the world from the perspective of somebody who's on the autistic spectrum, for example. It'll be a very high functioning individual, but they also have a different way of looking at things. It can be challenging for the coach to work with this. We have to leave behind a lot of our assumptions. And so this is how we grow and we mature, by leaving behind assumptions that only work in certain circumstances.
So true. So true. It's all about, as you mentioned already, it's important to question your own assumptions and be in that reflective space. David, what are some common misconceptions or myths about coaching maturity that I need to first take a pause and reflect on before I even begin my journey? Only then I'll be able to overcome them.
Well, one of the biggest myths, which has been highlighted by the research that our most recent research, is that idea that as you go through different levels of capability or competence as a coach, you simply do what you did at the beginning, only more effectively. And the answer is there is absolutely no evidence for this whatsoever.
Absolutely no, period.
Zero. And the lovely comparison that one of our colleagues put is you're learning music. So you start off with music and you learn to play the scales. So you're judged and assessed according to how efficiently you can bang on the keys. And then you get assessed where you can play put them all together to a simple tune. Going through your bases, the doing to the doing with now. And then you eventually get so that you can play tunes. You can pick up the music and you can play from the music, and then you start to improvise a bit. You begin to insert your personality and your character into the music that you play. And then you go join a jazz group. And the music could go in any direction, but you're there and you're so connected with your colleagues, jazz group, where they go, you go, and you could suddenly lead them off in a different direction. It's unpredictable, or much less predictable, and it's inventive, it's creative, it's liberating. So I think this is a wonderful analogy.
So true, so true. It's like you cannot continue to rely on the tricks that you learned in the initial phase of your journey. Why? Because the person you were when you learned those tricks has already been destroyed.
Mm.
Who you are today is very different from where you started that journey. And as you said it, David, who you are has a huge impact on the conversation that you engage with the other person. So that means you have to relook at a new set of tricks that go really well in alignment to who you are so that you can serve the other person in the best possible manner. David, how can coaches benefit from becoming mature and actively engaging in their own professional development? And what kind of shifts that they can expect in their personal lives as well? Because I don't believe that you are of one kind in your practice as a coach and you're totally opposite as a person. I don't believe in that. So
The first thing, if you want to be a coach in 5 years' time, you better up your game, because artificial intelligence can already do it better than the most basic coaches can. And the artificial intelligence is getting better and better. So going through a model and a process, the AI is going to be much more effective. That market is dying, is going to go. And so this is the sort of ACC equivalent in ICF terms. What you now have to move beyond that, you've got to progress. You're keeping ahead of this lion chasing you, because it's getting better and better. So the only way to do that is to be able to grow and mature and become able to cope with greater and greater complexity.
So that means it's good to have to invest on yourself and become a better coach. I think it's becoming a necessity. In case you don't get better, AI coaching is going to kick you out of the role as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And,
Yeah,
and we can learn to work with AI. We can partner with AI and use it as a tool to help us enhance our coaching. But
absolutely.
basically, if we're just going to go through a process, not much of a future for that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on what coaching maturity is, the benefits of imbibing that kind of mindset and identity and approach to your coaching practice, and what are the different ways that could help us to add more depth and gravitas to my own self as a coach. David, you are coming to India with a program called Coaching Maturity. It's a 2-day program that you are delivering in August. If you can just help us understand what people can expect from that 2 days program and what is your personal commitment to them?
So the first thing that they can expect is some deeper insights into where they are. And this is not about making judgment. It's about them making their own assessment of where they are in terms of the journey towards becoming a systemic eclectic coach. And a lot of that is about, how do you want to add value? What's the value that you want to create for your clients and the organizations that employ them? And so understanding where you want to go, then you can start to build your coach development plan that will take you there. What we're looking at is the transitions that you can make between one way of thinking and the next. What needs to change in the way that you observe things, for example, what you're aware of in the coaching conversation. So it's not about suddenly rushing to become a systemic eclectic. That's something that happens over time, because it's an integration of the maturing person that you are with the maturing practice that you have. But what it does is to give you an impetus. It will help you to see much more clearly where you're going, where you want to go, and the learning and experience that you need to gather in order to get there.
And David, if you can just share, how excited are you to come to India? And if you can also share, how was your last experience when you were in India last year? What are you looking forward to experience in India?
Oh, thank you. Well, I find the cultures, because there are so many cultures in India, so absolutely fascinating. And of course, I enjoy the food. But the interactions with people, India has so much history, and that shapes the way that people think, and the cultural identity shapes the individual identity. And we shouldn't forget that the origins of coaching, of modern coaching methods, really, Timothy Galway came to India to learn different ways of helping people to learn. It's wonderful for me to be able to go, as in other countries, to go and spend time with people, listening to them and learning from them. So it's a continuous learning journey for me too.